Okay. So welcome everybody. Before I get started, just a little bit of background on sort of why I'm doing this. For those of you who don't know me, I am Lynn Santelman. We have been members here since about 2000, just before our son Tommy was born. That's how I can judge it. So 24 years. He was born in April of 2001. So I know, it's like, so my kids were raised here. By profession, I am a linguist. I work at Portland State. I am a professor of applied linguistics. And I don't teach anything I actually am going to do here, or very little of what I do here. But I've always been interested in the history of languages, and you'll get a tiny bit of that today, but also sort of Bible translations. Because of my background as a linguist, I know that it's difficult to, let me move my chair back so I can see everybody. I know that some of the issues that come up in translation and translation studies that people who don't work with language every day don't necessarily think about. And so that's sort of the perspective that I want to give here. But then also, and so that's what we're going to do for most of this course. I would just point out that apparently my course title was too long because it's never been right in any publication yet. It's the words plural of God, which I think is actually important because it points out, for me at least, that there isn't just one Word of God when we're talking about these sources. The languages and translations of the Bible, which I think was the part that's too long to get into the bulletin. So just a brief overview of what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with... It's too loud. It's still too loud? Steve, could you lower me? So we're going to start this week, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the history of the region related to languages and the writing of the Bible. A little bit about the culture. That might be too low. Is that good? Okay. And then next week, we'll talk about some of the early translations of the Bible, actually starting with translations of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and then translations into Latin, and then translations into the vernacular. And I will tell you about the translator who translated the Bible, was excommunicated by the church, died of a disease, and then the Catholic Church dug him up and burned him because it was a heresy, and they really needed to make sure that it was a heresy. So, you know, the guy who was burned after death, which shows some of the resistance to the translation and sort of what were the thoughts or the cultural reasons for not wanting translations of the Bible into the vernacular. And then we'll probably conclude with some of the early translations into the vernacular. Week 3, we'll talk about the different sort of paths into translating the Bible. There are translations that are true to the original words, that try to do more of a word-by-word translation, and there are translations that are more true to the message. And this is always a tension when you are doing any kind of translation work, because it is, sometimes if you're true to the word, you're not actually true to the message, and so, some of it also depends then on your belief of who is it that wrote down these words, and where did these words come from. And then week 4, okay, this is where I confess less knowledge. So we'll see what happens here. There is the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, is the version that we use in our church. They've now come up with an updated edition. So now it's the New Revised Standard Updated Edition. And I'll talk a little bit about where those updates came from and why those updates are important, and sort of what ongoing scholarship is and why we will probably keep revising the Bible henceforth. No, but you're going to get to listen to the Gen Z version right now. So this is actually, I overheard a conversation my students were having while they were doing group work. I have no idea how it came up in their conversation, but I heard it immediately and thought, this is perfect for my class, because it is a translation of the Bible. So we'll hear two stories. The first is David and Goliath.
David and Goliath, the Gen Z version. This is going to be a really good one. Let's read this together. Goliath was flexing hard, talking smack to the Israelites like he owned the place. But then, young David stepped up, looked him dead in the eye, and dropped the bomb. David said, "Yo, Goliath, listen up. You're about to flex life with your weapons and your armor, but I'm here to tell you, it's not about it's about your lives with the Most High." I'm getting chills. It's pretty good. So Goliath was straight up towering over everyone like he owned the place. But little did he know, that young buck named David was about to show him what's what. So David reached into his bag, pulled out his latest tech, a slick slingshot, and let it fly. The rock soared through the air, hitting Goliath right in the sweet spot. The giant went down like a domino, crashing to the ground. David, he was just getting started, proving that sometimes all you need is a little faith and a whole lot.
Yeah, no.
So good.
All right, and then we'll do, let's see, I have to figure where my speakers are on this.
The Ten Commandments in the Gen Z version. This is going to bother some. That's not me. I don't want to bother. Commandment 1. Be all in with the big guy. No other
Here we go.
gods. Commandment 2. Don't be throwing around God's name like it's no big deal. Commandment 3. Chill out on the seventh day. 5. With the big guy. Commandment 4. Respect your squad, especially your family, because they're key. Commandment 5. No capping or fake news with the squad. Keep it 100. Commandment 6. No drama with the squad. Keep it real and don't off anyone. Commandment 7. Stay loyal in your relationships. No sliding in your DMs on the low. Commandment 8. Keep it real, fam. Don't be copying stuff that ain't yours. Commandment 9. Don't be spreading lies or gossip. Keep the vibes positive. Commandment 10. Stay in your lane. Don't be eyeing other people's stuff. Leave a comment below on what you want to see in the Gen Z version.
So, one of the reasons I like that, oh shoot, now I got to figure out how to get off of this slide. No, I don't want to do it. Is that it really brings up a lot of issues in translation. Okay, so, is it okay to translate things into this kind of vernacular? How much of that did y'all understand? We are not their target market for this at all. And so, but one of the things it brings up is we really need to understand the culture from which these words are coming from. And if you don't, then you aren't going to understand what it all means. So, I forgot to bring this. All right, this is a low-stakes quiz. I want you to talk with the people at your tables and answer the following question. When were the first 5 books of the Old Testament written? Now, I'm going to give you some multiple choice here. Approximately 1500 BC, 1000 BC, 500 BC, 400 BC. All right, I'll give you 2 minutes to talk to people near you to see if you can come up with an answer. Yeah. No fair if you have a pastor or someone knowledgeable at your table.
I would guess probably the closest date there would be 500 BC.
All right. Just the first 5 books.
We don't know.
Well, what's your best guess?
Either 4 or 5.
Yeah, 4 or 5.
All right, so here, I'll have 2 tables give their best guesses, and I'm picking on the people who don't have pastors or seminarians at their table. Just talk.
Okay, we chose 400 with a second choice of 500 BC.
All right, you are not wrong. All right. Do I have any other times? All right, 400 to 500 here. 500.
Our ranked choice voting is 500 and then 400.
Okay, you actually have to say that into the mic so the people on the recording can hear you.
Our ranked choice voting is 500 BC with 400 BC as our second.
Excellent. See, the things that ranked choice voting can give us ways to do multiple choice. The answer is complicated. Different versions were written down between about 1,000 and 400 BC. Right. So actually, the only date there that I would say is wrong would be 1500. And it's not wrong in terms of there was an oral tradition that came before this, but in terms of actually having evidence for written documents, that's too early. But starting at about 1000 BC is when things started to be written down. And then these were based on the earlier oral traditions. And there's actually evidence for 4 different sources for these first 5 books of the Bible written at different times. The earliest 2, they're named after, basically, the first 2 are named after what they called God. So the J version generally uses the divine name Yahweh, which is spelled with a J in German, and it was German scholars who were doing this, so we get the J version, or the Y version if you want that. The E version uses the divine name El or Elohim, which is often translated as God in our texts. There's a D version, which includes the writer of Deuteronomy and some other chapters. And then there's a P version, which seems to be written by people from the priestly tradition, and so it has a priestly source. And if you look at all of these together, you have the early and written, oral and written sources that led in about 900 to BC to 2 different versions of these books, and I'll show you how they can tell they're 2 different versions in just a minute here. But one of them was from the Northern Kingdom, and one of them was in the Southern Kingdom, and so you get little differences in emphases. These were probably combined around the time that the Northern Kingdom fell, and then during the Babylonian exile, and after that, we got the addition of the Deuteronomy texts and the priestly texts, so that by about 400 BC, so that's perhaps the most right answer. These were combined into one text that has been passed down. Now, this combination wasn't just this book did Genesis, this version did Genesis 1, and this version did Genesis 2. It was actually pretty much blended together. And so there's an unknown author who synthesized all of these different versions and put them together. So if you read the story of Noah, for example, there are it seems to be saying the same thing a couple of times, but in slightly different ways. And that's because it's been incorporating these 2 different versions. And I'll show you some other examples of that. So the J author lived in the Southern Kingdom of Judah, and it is the source of much of that we have of Genesis. And you can tell from the things that it emphasizes that it's sort of emphasizing the kingdom of Judah and its way of thinking. The E, as I noted, lived in the Northern Kingdom of Israel. Parts of Genesis come from that, as well as much of Exodus and Numbers. They were merged, as I noted. D wrote Deuteronomy and probably Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and they lived most likely in the Southern Kingdom of Judah because that was the only one left after the fall of the Northern Kingdom. And the priestly sources, that's where we get a lot of our genealogies. It's like, why the heck Do we care who was born of whom? And do you need to go on for 4 pages of this? Well, that was important to the priestly tradition because one of the things they were trying to do is establish that they were descendants of Aaron, one of the first priests. You sort of had competing priestly traditions, one from Moses and one from Aaron. And the ones from Aaron were originally in the north, and then they had to flee south. And so they had suffered a lot of persecution and had kind of a big chip on their shoulder and wanted to establish their supremacy. So why does it matter? It matters because knowing the sources helps us interpret the texts. As I noted, they emphasize different aspects of the events that they are recording, and they inserted little details to support their view. And I'm going to give you an example. So this is the example where Moses taps the rock and gets water from the rock. It's a very familiar story. It's actually in the Bible twice, once in Exodus and once in Numbers. Since we hardly ever sit down and read the Bible cover to cover, we sometimes don't notice that there's often 2 versions of these stories. I mean, the clearest one is Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. It's like, why are there 2 different versions of the creation story? Well, one came from J and one came from E, and they emphasize slightly different things. So the first one we have here, this is actually from an E text. But there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled, and Moses said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, "What shall I do for this people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Go ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it, so that people may drink." Moses did so in sight of the elders. Very familiar story. One thing I will point out is that they use the name Horeb. That was the name that the E-text tended to use. The J-text tended to use the name Sinai. So this is why we're confused about geography as well. It's like Mount of Sinai, Mount of Horeb, which one is which? All right. The next version, you'll notice it's slightly longer, they've added a few things to it, is the priestly story. And I've highlighted a few of the differences here. Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and against Aaron. Ooh, Aaron's there. He wasn't there in the first story, was he? The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had died when our kindred died before the Lord. Why have you brought this assembly of the Lord into this wilderness for us and for our livestock to die here? Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron went away from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of the meeting. That's a new detail here. And they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Another new detail. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and your brother Aaron, and command the rock before their eyes to yield its water. Thus you shall bring water out of the rock for them. Thus you shall provide the drink for the congregation and the livestock." So Moses took the staff before the Lord as he commanded him. Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Listen, you rebels. Shall we bring water out for you out of the rock?" Then Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land I have given them." So if you know that these are written by 2 different authors, the differences make sense. So Aaron was added here because Aaron was the progenitor of the priestly tribe that was writing this. And if you notice, it's emphasizing things like tent of the meeting and falling on their faces. It's emphasizing the holiness of these particular priests. And then we have this whole sort of retribution against Moses for reasons that nobody really understands, but poor Aaron gets sucked along with it. And so the core story is the same. The peace story adds Aaron because the writer was most likely a priestly descendant of Aaron, and they wanted to emphasize Aaron's part in this and give Aaron more legitimacy. Note also that in Exodus, getting water was good, but in the Numbers text, it's actually an act of disobedience. Then we have that whole line about you rebels. It's like, hey, you're not trusting in me to lead you out. And so there's more about going against the regime, shall we say. And as I noted, poor Aaron gets punished alongside Moses. So this text is definitely more sympathetic to the Aaron tradition than the earlier text was, where Aaron wasn't there at all. Moses did it all himself. All right, so why does this matter for translations of the Bible? It's evidence that unless we understand the history and the cultural viewpoint of the writers, we won't be able to really interpret what they wrote. For example, theology really can't help us understand why one verse of the Bible has Noah bringing just one pair of each animal, and another has Noah bringing 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals. This is all in the story of Noah. When we hear it as kids, it sort of gets glossed over. You know, we get the giraffes and the elephants and the lions and all those other cute animals coming in. There's no discussion of the clean and unclean animals are okay. You know, why are there 7 pairs of sheep and goats and only, 1 pair of pigs? That isn't there at all, and that's never explained. And theologians have spent time before they sort of recognized the different sources, trying to explain why these details might be different in different parts of the story. It's much easier to explain from sort of an author perspective than it is from a theological perspective. So if we can't interpret the text, we can't translate it. So the first thing we need to be able to do is understand what is in the text, and then we can translate it. All right, a bit more cultural background. The dominant religion of the region was pagan. This particular pagan religion is familiar to us through actually the transmission of some of the Greek and Roman mythology. People worshipped the powerful forces of nature, the sun, the sky, the wind, fertility, those sorts of things. So Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of fertility, was named something else in these different cultures, but they all kind of recognize the same pantheon of gods. And because these deities were so similar from group to group, it was actually pretty easy if somebody conquered you to start worshiping their gods, because it was actually the same as your gods, only a slightly different name. Well, heck, okay, if I'm going to worship Aphrodite and they want to call her, what was the Roman name for Aphrodite? It wasn't Venus, thank you. Sure, why not? Works for me. And they did use statuary, although the statues were not objects of worship, rather they were representations, sort of reminders to people. Much like the crucifix is today, we don't worship the cross. We recognize it as a symbol of what's going on, of Christ's death and our redemption, but it's not the actual object of worship. There are reasons why the Catholics have the crucifix and the Protestants have the cross. It was partly to get away from this idea that you're actually worshiping the cross rather than worshiping Jesus on the crucifix. Pagan deities at the time, of note, for a lot of the area, the chief god was named El. If you notice, the e-text used the word Elohim, which is actually plural. It kind of just is the generic word for gods. And there's a reason for that, is because all their neighbors were kind of also using that name. And so they adopted it, only it meant something slightly different for them. This was the one God that was sort of different. It was not a God of a specific power like wind or sea. Rather, it was a God of outside the other ones, and was sort of the head of the godly council, shall we say. If we can call it a godly council. Council of gods, there we go. I knew that I had a better word. For the Israelites, Yahweh was something similar. Yahweh was not a specific God of a specific power. It was sort of outside the regular forces. This was in tradition. Many nations had kind of their God. Okay, so when you talk about, you see these passages in the Old Testament where it's like, oh yeah, well, my God is better than your God. And that's exactly what they were doing. The thing that made the Israelites different was the Israelites were not willing to shift their allegiance to another God when they got captured and transported off to other places. So it's like, no, Yahweh is the one and only God. And so the shift from sort of, yeah, okay, we're all pagan, we all have this kind of vaguely accepted set of gods, and Yahweh or El are above them all, to, no, Yahweh's the one and only God, and we're not going to have other gods, was really the major cultural shift that separated the Israelites from the rest of the people in that particular region. And that's one of the reasons why culturally that was so emphasized in so many verses in the Bible. Historically, there's some evidence that, yeah, there was only one God, and there was also other gods being talked about during the time of the writing of the Bible. They didn't give up paganism all at once. I sort of view it as like, when the Vikings were converted to Christianity. Yeah, we'll convert to Christianity, and Thor is still in charge. And so not all of the tribes were as eager to accept the one God as others. All right, another time for you to engage your brains again. Getting down to language. What do you know about languages used to write the Bible? So, which languages was the Bible originally written in? Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, or Latin? And there may be more than one right answer here. So I'll give you 2 minutes to talk to each other. Well, that's which part of the Bible? You can separate out to Old and New Testament if you like. All right, I'm going to pick on a different table this time. Yeah. Larry can talk. Or Larry can hand it off.
The New Testament was primarily Greek.
Yep. Old Testament?
Hebrew and Aramaic.
All right. You get bonus points. Yes. So the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek were the primary languages of the Bible. The Old Testament was written first in Hebrew, but then also Aramaic, and we'll see why in just a minute. The New Testament was almost exclusively in Greek, which is actually a very different language from Hebrew and Aramaic. So if we look at the sort of languages of the ancient Middle East, the oldest written language that we know of is actually Sumerian, which died out in about 1700 BC. It's a little hard to see here, but it's a clay tablet with Sumerian writing on it. Mostly what they did here is they had sort of wet clay, and then they had styluses that they made marks in the clay with, which is why Most of the lines are sort of square, sharp angles. It's hard to do curves in wet clay. And I mean, if you look at, for example, at the runes that were in Scandinavia, most of those were that are still with us are things that are chiseled onto stone monuments. And again, most of those are square or sort of angled because, again, it's hard to do curves in stones. There was a version that was like inscribed on metal that was a little more flowing. But because what we have left are things in clay tablets, this is what we know about how it was written. We can read these texts. People have been able to translate them. We have no idea how they were pronounced because the language died out. And it seems to be unrelated to any other language of the region. So while they were a major power for a while, once they quit being a power, they got taken over by the Assyrians, basically. They were the Akkadians, and that was it for their language. The next important language is Akkadian, which is a Semitic language, so it's related to Hebrew and to Aramaic and Arabic, actually. And it was a dominant language for about 2,500 years in the region. It is the earliest attested Semitic language that we have. So this is the family tree. Linguists love to do these trees for related languages. So at the top is what's known as Proto-Semitic. Proto-Semitic is not a language that we have written down anywhere. It's what linguists have reconstructed or assumed to be what Semitic was like based on what we know about these other branches. And then it divided into West Semitic and East Semitic. East Semitic became Akkadian and Eblaite, but I don't know anything about Eblaite. Akkadian eventually became Assyrian and Babylonian. So you'll recognize those names from the Bible, the Babylonian exile. So when they went into Babylonian exile, they were actually going to a people who spoke a somewhat related language. It's sort of like French speakers being deported to Russia. Some of the things are going to be really familiar, and some of them are going to be like, you're doing what? West Semitic then gets divided into several other. There's a southern Arabian languages, Ethiopian languages, and Central Semitic is what we're most interested in because that gives us both modern-day Arabic and then Northwest Semitic, Aramaic. There was a precursor language called Canaanite, which gave both Phoenician and Hebrew, and then Ugaritic. So Aramaic and Hebrew, you can tell, are more closely related languages. They're sort of cousins rather than, like fifth cousins, which is what Babylonian was. So it wasn't that difficult necessarily to go between Hebrew and Aramaic. It might be, I'm trying to think of a modern day example, something like Italian and Romanian, where they're related. You can recognize some roots, and key to that was they were structured very similarly. So during Old Testament times, Akkadian was actually the majority language spoken in a lot of places. Hebrew was spoken among the Jews, and other related languages were spoken nearby. This area of the world, if you look at a map, is sort of at the crossroads of trade routes between, kind of around the Mediterranean. And so there was probably a lot of multilingualism going on around there. You had to be able to talk to your trading partners. So you knew Phoenician, you knew Aramaic, you knew Akkadian, or whatever else it was. And so going back and forth among these languages was not uncommon. So this is what the political map of the Middle East looked like, more or less, during the time when the Old Testament first began to be written down, you'll notice, okay, the Babylonians here have got, their empire is starting. The Phoenicians are a major power. The Philistines were a major power. We're not seeing a whole lot of Israel there as a major power. They were a minor force, and that also explains some of where these writings come from, because they had these bigger forces around them that they were trying to establish their own kingdoms or their own governance and their own identities. The Arameans, from which Aramaic comes from, are also nearby there, and the Assyrians. And then we may recognize like the Phrygians, and then we've got the whole Egyptian dynasty thing going on there. So linguistically, this is where I'm on firm ground here. The Semitic languages are very different from the languages that sort of we're used to, English, French, German, even Russian. They're structured very differently. They just have a whole different way of creating words that I'll show you in just a minute. The word order of Biblical Hebrew was verb, subject, object. So instead of saying, I see the dog, it was, see I, the dog. This can sometimes lead to issues in translation. Okay, if you're trying to be true to the word, are you also true to the word order? Or do you actually create a word order that makes sense in your language? And when we look at translations of the Bible, sometimes they go one way and sometimes they go another.
Is this like throw me down the stairs, my hat?
So the question was, is this like throw me down the stairs, my hat? Yes. That would actually be throw my hat. Yeah, similar to that's sort of more of a German word order kind of thing. My mom always used to say, yeah, throw the cow over the fence some hay. Right, and you can be true to the word order, and yeah, speakers can kind of get a sense of what that means, but dang, it does not sound natural. And so there's always going to be a tension there when you're translating as to what sounds natural and what the original text said. And if you believe that the actual words in the Greek or Hebrew Bible were, dictated by God, you're going to be very reluctant to change anything about them. And the word order thing doesn't even touch on things like poetry, where all rules of word order are thrown out the window, and you get to choose how you interpret this. Not quite that bad, but there are definitely things. Perhaps the most striking feature of Hebrew from a linguistic point of view is how they build words. So in English, we usually have a word root. So something like book, for example, and I can add a suffix to it and make it like bookish, or I can make a compound like bookkeeper, or I could, have a prefix like rebook, all of those kinds of things. So we take a core word and then we add things at the beginning and the end to make new words. In Hebrew, the core word was actually 3 consonants, what they known as the 3 consonant word roots, or triconsonantal if we're being academic about it. And these roots were the basis of all words. You use them to form nouns, you use them to form adjectives, you use them to form verbs. And you did this by adding different vowels in between the consonants, or by doubling consonants, and sometimes you would add a prefix or a suffix, but the core of the word is always these 3 consonants. And this, because the core of the word is always these 3 consonants, they don't actually write the consonants, or the vowels, sorry. They just write the consonants. And you're supposed to figure out what it means based on what's around it. So for someone who comes from an alphabetic tradition like we have, where we write the vowels because the vowels make a big difference, reading these texts is like, this is the same word like 12 different times, and yet it's not the same word 12 different times. So this is an example from modern Hebrew, which is related to Biblical Hebrew, but is not the same as Biblical Hebrew. The root KTB, which has to do with words and writing. The word kathabi, let's see if I can get this right, kavathti is I wrote. Katavet is reporter. So you see those K's, T's, and B's in there. Miktava is writing desk. KTB there. Kitab, handwriting. Kitab, spelling. Change one vowel, you get handwriting versus spelling. So you kind of have to know, okay, if you're in a text and you say KTB, is this I write? Or is this right? Is this handwriting? Is this spelling? This will raise issues in terms of how you translate these things. Now, some texts did have people go in and write in vowels or in sort of little extra marks called diacritics to clarify things, but mostly they left those out. We do something similar sometimes in English. So how do you know when you're reading something if you should pronounce it read or read? It's got to be context. Because we've sort of lost that sound spelling correspondence for that particular word. There's a number of words for English where we've done that. If English were a language like Spanish, we would have spelling reforms and get rid of those things. But we don't have anybody to do a spelling reform, and so we're sort of stuck with this Middle English spelling system that we've got. Ketovet, address. So all of these things related to writing. All right. My last quiz question for you. What do you know about the languages that were spoken in Israel when Jesus was born? I'll give you a minute for this. We're getting short in time. And note that the question is plural. All right, I'm going to pick on somebody from this table.
Well, Hebrew, Aramaic, and I think Assyrian.
No.
Okay. Well, there you have it.
But there are others.
Greek. Oh, yeah.
And a little bit of Latin,
Really?
probably. Probably not as much Latin as you might think, even though they were under Roman occupation at the time. In this region, Latin was not the language that those invading armies used. They used Greek. So Aramaic was the language that Jesus spoke and was the daily language. Hebrew was used, but by that time it was restricted mostly to religious contexts. So the Pharisees and the scribes probably spoke Hebrew. They might have spoken Hebrew among themselves. It was used in the temples, but it was not a daily language that people used. I sort of view it like, okay, in the Middle Ages, you know, if you were at a university in France, you may have communicated with other people in Latin, but then you went out on the street and you spoke medieval French. Greek was actually the lingua franca, or the language that was used to communicate among different peoples of the region. Remember that although the Romans were the power, they sort of just imported a whole bunch of Greek culture, and the Greeks were the ones who were the educated people. The Romans were the soldiers. So, hey, let's use their language. Latin was used for military and government purposes, but most people probably had very little contact with the Latin of the time. Maybe military dispatches, you know, some of the laws were written in Latin, but mostly it was Greek. And Assyrian had mostly died out by that time. So that's why Assyrian isn't there. There are still dialects of Assyrian now 2,000 years later, but they're not nearly. Aramaic was really the second biggest language of the time. And it's also important to note that most people were probably multilingual. So Jesus probably knew some Hebrew because he'd been educated in the temple. He definitely knew Aramaic. He may well have known some Greek, although how much a carpenter from Galilee was exposed to Greek, probably not a whole lot. But people in the cities, at least some of the traders, would have known some Greek.
Thanks, Lynn. It's interesting to note as well that fairly early on, there's a whole body of Aramaic literature called the Targums. All right, maybe you're going to talk about that. But the Targums, because the people, the masses of the people, were by and large illiterate. So there were scribes who were dealing with texts. They may know Hebrew. They may get up for religious reasons and recite the biblical or read the biblical text in Hebrew. But over time, at least in that part of the world, and this will come into play with Greek as well, people couldn't understand it. So they translated the biblical text into Aramaic, and those have been preserved and collected. We call them the Targums or Targumim, Aramaic texts, to deal with this linguistic and cross-cultural problem.
And that's sort of a theme that will carry through a lot of these translation stuff, Okay, then the Bible was translated into Latin, and then people quit being able to understand Latin, and so we need to translate it into something else. And so it keeps going like that. All right. Actually, I'm not going to do my very short tangent into writing. This is a great place to start next week in terms of, there is actually some debate about how literate the society around Jesus' time was. There's some evidence that there was, yes, the priests and the scribes definitely knew how to write. Carpenters probably didn't. But there were people who, there are fragments of like pot shards and things like that have writing on them from different hands, that were found in old forts and things like that to suggest, graffiti is actually a somewhat good source of knowing, who can write what. If you go around Rome, actually there's a whole bunch of like Roman graffiti in some of these ancient walls. Yes, mostly it was carved into those walls. And so, there are some people who said, well, the people of Israel were not literate enough in 1000 BC to really write the Bible. And that's probably not. Evidence doesn't suggest that. But how many people were literate enough to be able to go read in the temples? And that may be one of the reasons that when Jesus spoke with authority, people were surprised. It's like, what the heck is this carpenter from Galilee doing? Speaking with authority, he hasn't been trained in our tradition. He may not have been able to read. There's no part of the Bible where we see that Jesus was sending off written messages to his friends. Gretchen first.
As a carpenter, though, he would be drawing things out and adding things up and making notes.
Right. I mean, as a carpenter, he certainly needed math skills and be able to figure and plan sorts of things. How much of that was written in a form? I mean, he wasn't writing it down on paper to do it. They were probably sketching it in the dirt or, the dust or whatever, because, papyrus was expensive and vellum, which is even more expensive. But part of the reason we don't know these things is because most of the surfaces on which they would have written don't last over time. We just don't have records of those. So,
One story though where he was in kind of his own hometown and he's like in the service and I thought he was giving the lesson for the day.
oh gosh, now you're gonna make me go back to my Bible. So the question was, isn't there the story where Jesus goes back to his home temple and he reads in the temple?
Like he reads the lesson for the day, but then he said it's being fulfilled in him and then.
Right, and it's fulfilled in him, and that's when they said, who the heck are you to say something like this? Right.
But do we take it literally?
Right. Do we take it literally?
And we know that the Jesus tradition had a period of oral tradition prior to being written down.
Right.
Gospel writers now writing in Greek, maybe telling the story from their world.
Right, so what Jim said was that, we know from the oral tradition that there was a period before these Gospels were written down, and so maybe the Greeks are telling it from their perspective. The other thing is there was a strong oral tradition, and it's possible that he memorized sections of the Torah. When kids do their bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs today, they have to memorize these sections. So it's possible that he could have recited it without being able to read it.
Was he for sure a carpenter or a builder?
Was he a carpenter or a builder? I cannot answer that question because it has nothing to do with language, and I've never thought about it. I can make something up. That is one of my talents, but I would prefer not to do that about this particular detail. All right, Steve might be able to answer that.
I can only answer what I have read in places, and one author that I've read said that Jesus probably wasn't a carpenter in the sense of making fine furniture, but he would have worked in the building trades, and that may have meant something like cutting beams for putting in buildings, right?
Right, yeah, so in modern terms, it would be, a rough carpenter, a finished carpenter, or a cabinet maker. German actually has two different words for those. You have the people who are sort of the builders, and then you have the people who are the cabinet makers. And so, yeah. And they were really good stonemasons, right? Most of the houses were 1 or 2 story stone buildings. And built for sort of the climates there. So, and most of the cities were fairly densely populated. The northern part of Israel was fairly fertile. The southern part was more desert. So, we have lots of things that feed into this.
Yes, thanks, Lynn. It is interesting if you go today to Nazareth, which is a throbbing kind of place. You may also go to a place, as the crow would fly, 3 or 4 miles away, Sepphoris. And undoubtedly in Sepphoris, there were Greek speakers. Nazareth, probably not so much, if at all. It was a little village. So our assumption has to come into a play here. How much did people walk and migrate those few miles back and forth? Personally, I'm inclined to think less rather than more. They were culturally very divided. The Greco-Roman rule in the 1st century and beyond in Sepphoris left mosaics and artwork and structures of one sort and not over time. Is less clear, if anything, from the 1st century has survived Nazareth, which, as I say, today is a hubbub kind of place of maybe 100, 150,000 people. Sepphoris is an archaeological site.
All right, thank you, Jim. And now that it's 11:55, I will let you go. And next week we will pick up with writing and other things. Thank you very much for coming.